In the second part of this episode, I want to talk about Khurasan and the Abbasid revolution. Now, there was a small connection between this conquest of Jurjan and the Abbasid revolution. The conquests of Jurjan and Tabaristan were admittedly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. They were two small regions near the southern Caspian Sea that added to the Umayyad conquest and continued to expand the Khurasan province. However, the army that conquered Jurjan included a man named Bukir ibn Mahan. Bukir ibn Mahan would be one of the leaders of the Abbasid conspiracy. The Abbasid revolution began in 747 CE, but the conspiracy that led to the revolution began in 718 CE, which is the year after the conquest of Jurjan and Tabaristan. Now let's ask ourselves, why Khurasan? Why did the Abbasid conspiracy and the Abbasid revolution begin in Khurasan? Why didn't this conspiracy and this revolution begin in some of the more established areas like Iraq or the Hajjaj or Syria? Well, for one thing, each of these regions already had their loyalties set with someone else or with some other group. For instance, Iraq was loyal to Ali ibn Abi Talib and his descendants, and Iraq was also full of Khawarij. The Hijaz was more or less loyal to Ibn Zubair and to a lesser extent Hussein ibn Ali. And Syria obviously was loyal to the Umayyads. But Khurasan was considered frontier territory at the time. Also, Khurasan was virgin territory and didn't have these embedded loyalties that these other regions had. So now let's talk about Khurasan's warriors, its fighting force, its fighting men. Since Khurasan was frontier territory and the center of Islamic expansion, it produced a lot of skilled and experienced warriors. These skilled warriors were both Arab and non-Arab, and if they were non-Arab, they were usually Turkic or Persian. And as we've seen throughout this series, the fighting men of Khurasan were almost always at war. Whether they were Arab or Turkic or Persian, they were always fighting. Either they were conquering new territory, or they were putting down rebellions, or they were fighting amongst themselves. Because of all of this military activity, Khurasan also attracted thousands of Arab warriors, most of them coming from Iraq. And the fighting prowess of these experienced, skilled, Muslim Khurasani warriors made them an excellent choice for the Abbasids to recruit to their cause. This brings us to the connection between Khurasan and Iraq, that is, the Umayyad provinces of Khurasan and Iraq. The province of Khurasan was actually a sub-province of Iraq. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, as we've seen throughout this series, as governor of Iraq, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf appointed and dismissed governors of Khurasan at will. Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra, Yazid ibn Muhallab, and Qutayba ibn Muslim were all appointed by Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Khurasan had been captured by Umayyad forces coming from Iraq, especially from Basra. And most of the Arabs in Khurasan were originally from Basra. These Arabs brought their tribal rivalries and differences from Iraq with them to Khurasan. So the Arab settlement of Khurasan helped to push it towards conspiracy and eventually open rebellion. Now, we have discussed the tribal rivalries in Iraq and Basra in the past. In fact, the third episode of the Ibn Zubair series mentioned fighting in Iraq after Yazid ibn Muawiyah died. Let's listen to a brief clip from that episode. Fighting broke out, as I mentioned, between the Tamim and the Bakr. So there's three tribes we're going to talk about in this episode. Tamim, Bakr, and Azd. The man we mentioned who Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was taking refuge with, who he was hiding with, that was Mas'ud ibn Amr. He was the chief of the Azd tribe. So Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he sees the Tamim and the Bakr fighting each other. So he sees an opportunity to try to strengthen his position and use this conflict to his advantage. He decides to, or he tries to create a coalition between the Azd and the Bakr against the Tamim. Don't know what his thinking was, but somehow or another he comes to the conclusion that if he can get these two tribes to align themselves with each other and then go against the Tamim that will give him a little bit more strength. And he presents this opportunity to these two tribes, and he encourages Mas'ud to join forces with the leader of the Bakr tribe, which is whose name is Malik ibn Misma. This tribal rivalry generally ran along north versus south lines. There were the northern Arabs or Mudar tribes. They were also called Adnanites as they were descended from Adnan, who was descended from Prophet Ismail alayhi salam. And then there were the southern Arabs or the Qahtan tribes. Most of them were generally from Yemen. Now, these are very broad definitions as these alliances between the various tribes did not always follow this pattern, and we'll see that in a few moments, inshallah. The population of Basra was initially divided into 5 different tribal groups. They were Banu Azd, Banu Tamim, Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il, Banu Abdul Qais or just Banu Qais, and finally Banu Ahlul Aliyah. By the time Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan died, the relationship and the dynamics between these groups had already been pretty much set in stone. The Tamim were essentially the strongest group in Basra. However, shortly after Yazid ibn Muawiyah succeeded his father, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, as Caliph of the Umayyad Dynasty, a branch of the Azd, Banu Azd, migrated from Oman to Basra. The Azd were from Oman, and of course Oman is in southern Arabia. Therefore, the Azd were a Qahtan tribe. The arrival of these Azdi migrants changed everything in Basra. With this sudden increase in the Azd population, the Tamim began to feel threatened in their position as the dominant tribe. Banu Bakr and Banu Qais were technically Mudar tribes. They were technically northern tribes. But since they were rivals against the Tamim, they joined forces with the Azd. So now there were 2 major tribal alliances. The Tamim on one side and the Azd, the Bakr, and the Qais on the other side. And all of this rivalry wound up moving to Khurasan when the Umayyads began campaigning there. Now, we can't talk about Khurasan without discussing the Muhallab clan. Despite what was happening in Iraq, the Azd did not have any great strength in Khurasan for many years. All of this changed, however, when Hajjaj ibn Yusuf appointed Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra as governor of Khurasan. This took place in 78 AH, and we discussed this in the first season of the Umayyad Caliphate in the 11th episode. Muhallab had successfully defeated the Azarika Khawarij, and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf rewarded him by making him governor of Khurasan. Muhallab was originally from Oman, and therefore he was from the Azd. When Muhallab took over as governor of Khurasan, he brought along his experienced army that had defeated the Khawarij. Also, as governor, he began to encourage more Azd to migrate to Khurasan. Now, even though it took at least 10 years, the same alliance that had existed in Basra eventually took shape in Khurasan as well. That is, with the Tamim on one side and the Azd, the Qais, and Bani Bakr ibn Wa'il on the other side. Even though the Azd alliance was larger than the Tamim were still very strong. This meant that the Mudar tribes, the northern tribes, which were headed by the Tamim, were able to neutralize or equal the greater numbers of the Azd alliance. Now, this is my conjecture here. This is my own personal reflections, not necessarily from any research I've done, but I believe that the Mudar tribes headed by the Tamim were able to maintain an equal footing with the Azd and their allies because they were northern tribes. The Quraysh were Mudar, and the Umayyads, who were the ruling dynasty at the time, were part of the Quraysh. So the Umayyads were also Mudar. This alone might have been enough to allow the numerically smaller, and only slightly numerically smaller, the numerically smaller Tamim and their alliance to counterbalance the Azd and their allies. So with both sides relatively equal in strength, dominance in Khurasan depended on who was in charge. Whichever side the governor favored would have the upper hand until things changed. Both sides actually felt justified in demanding their dominance, their control over Khurasan. The Tamim were actually the first Arabs to conquer Khurasan, which, as we mentioned earlier, began during the Caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu.